Thank you, Speaker. I rise today to speak on the Children and Health Legislation Amendment Statement, Recognition, Aboriginal Self-Determination and Other Matters Bill 2023. This bill replaces a previous version which lapsed within the last Parliament with some minor changes introduced. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge our local Indigenous communities as I stand proudly today alongside my National Party colleagues, committed to supporting meaningful action to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I want to particularly acknowledge the Leader of the Nationals and the Member for Shepparton, both speaking on this bill, and who both have high Indigenous populations in their electorates and have built strong, collaborative and meaningful connections with First Nations groups within their communities. We pride ourselves on our strong connection to community, and I know this is no different when it comes to our First Nations people. Northern Victoria is home to a large percentage of Indigenous Australians, and we are all committed to working to ensure outcomes are improved by listening and engaging with these important local voices. We're committed to supporting the treaty process for our First Nations people, and while I was not here in this chamber last year, I can imagine how incredibly powerful it would have been to stand in this place and support the treaty process, action that represents the core principle of self-determination. This is outlined in new Section 7B of the bill, which acknowledges the treaty process being undertaken in Victoria, something which I am glad has bipartisan support. It also acknowledges the aspiration of Aboriginal people to achieve increased autonomy, decision-making and control of planning, funding and administration of services for Aboriginal children and families, including through representative bodies established via the treaty process. The electorate of Euroa is predominantly covered by the Yorta Yorta and Tanarong registered Aboriginal parties. Across our region, there is evidence of scar trees, rock shelters, rock art and place names that all reflect the deep and long-lasting history and connection Indigenous people have with our beautiful part of the world. I'm looking forward to engaging and working with representatives of our First Nations people over the next 4 years. As outlined in this bill, self-determination is a step towards closing the gap. In this case, it is clear the Victorian Government is failing in its target to reduce the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the care system by 45% by 2031. Sadly, in Victoria, we have the worst rate in the country of Aboriginal children in care, with 1 in 10 Indigenous kids in care on any given day. Worryingly, the rate of overrepresentation has skyrocketed since 2014, with this increasing by 63%. Most Aboriginal children in care within Victoria are in kinship care, an important arrangement that protects connection to culture and family where possible. The majority of these cases are managed by the Department rather than community agencies. This is important to note given the Auditor-General found that 84% of the time the Department case managers fail to carry out any welfare checks on children in kinship care. I would like to thank the Shadow Minister in the other place for the extensive consultation undertaken in regard to this bill, given the Liberals and Nationals have been calling for increased powers for Aboriginal organisations for a significant period of time. This is why it makes sense for Indigenous children to be provided protections that align with children in foster care by increasing the power of Aboriginal-led community agencies. When this bill came before Parliament previously, our support was unanimous. Since then, the minor changes made to the bill range from legislating a series of Aboriginal child placement principles, giving Aboriginal community organisations the power to investigate reports rather than having to refer them back to the Department, and removing outdated and offensive language with more modern terms such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island person. Alongside reform to important child protection legislation, this bill also includes recognition principles which are to apply in relation to dealings with Aboriginal children, families and Aboriginal-led community services. Like every country across the world, Australia has a complex history, one that is contested, difficult to grapple with at times, but also incredibly brilliant at others. Without doubt, we do live in the greatest nation in the world, that is the most free and fair, but as Closing of the Gap reports year after year show, there is significant work that still needs to be done to create a society where access to equality of outcomes exist. Our nation and our state have seen important reforms relating to Indigenous Australia over the decades and significant landmarks, which I'd like to make note of. The 1967 referendum to count Indigenous Australians within the census and removing race powers from the state. In 1970, Victoria was the first state in the nation to grant freehold title in Indigenous communities through the passage of the Aboriginal Land Act. In 1971, the first Indigenous man was elected to the Senate. In 1976, Aboriginal land rights, the first legislation in Australia that enabled First Nations people to claim land rights for country where traditional ownership could be proven. In 1997, Jeff Kennett moved that this House apologises to the Aboriginal people on behalf of all Victorians for the past policies under which Aboriginal children were removed from their families, and expresses deep regret at the hurt and distress this has caused, and reaffirms its support for reconciliation between all Australians. Even more recently, in 2010, we saw the election of Ken Wyatt, the first Indigenous man elected to the House of Representatives, the first Indigenous man in Cabinet, and the first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Australians. These are all reforms and important milestones that have occurred thanks to this side of politics at both federal and state levels. There is no doubt those opposite have pushed important reforms at both levels of government, but it's important to note that a commitment to closing the gap and improve the outcomes for Indigenous Australians is a bipartisan commitment. It is one I hope all members in both houses now and into the future are wedded to. We are in the middle of a national debate that is incredibly polarising. While people may have different views on the way in which we close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, I know everyone is committed to closing that very gap. While this bill doesn't sit alongside some of the major reforms we've seen throughout history, it is my belief that it is an incremental step in improving the system for Indigenous youth and families and developing a system more attuned to the needs of vulnerable children. We know the importance of children being raised in a loving environment and having the best possible chance at succeeding in life. I think it's pretty devastating. The Commission for Children and Young People recently found that there had been a disproportionate increase in deaths of Aboriginal children in care in recent years, including 13 of the 45 deaths last year in 2021. It is heartbreaking and things are failing. In summary, the objectives of this bill is outlined by the Minister to eliminate the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in care, increase Aboriginal care, guardianship and management of Aboriginal children and young people in care, and increase family reunification for Aboriginal children and young people in care are ones which we can all support, and I provide my full support for this bill.